Very first thing that we're going to want to do before we start creating our new level is, of course, create a brand new project for it. So we'll go up to File, and then we'll go down to New Project. And again, you're going to get this New Project dialog box, the Project Wizard. And you can see here we have the project directory, which is where your new project is going to be saved. So we can go ahead and give it a name right now. So give it any name you want, but I'm just going to call this basic_level. And then below are all the different packages that can be preloaded into your project. Now, we're not going to worry about what all of these do right now. We're actually going to load in just a few of these as we need them. You could load in all of these now, and it would take Unity a bit of time to load everything up, and then you'd be facing a whole bunch of folders like you see here, which isn't what we want. We kind of want to import things as we need them. That way we know exactly what they are, and we learn about them as we need them, instead of just trying to figure out what all these folders mean. So right now, don't worry about checking anything, and then we can click Create New Project. Now, it's going to ask you if you want to save any changes you made to your current project. So if you have been working on something and you want to save it now. In this case, I haven't, so I won't save. And that's going to relaunch Unity, close down the old project, and just completely launch Unity all over again. And now that we have a new blank project, we don't have any excess folders or any excess assets that we don't need. So let's just go ahead and close down the welcome dialog. And let's get started with creating a basic level with some of the basic primitives that we've already worked with and manipulated here inside Unity. So you may want to put a little bit of thought into this prior. What kind of level do you want? But we're just going to kind of free-form create something, nothing too complicated, but get a little bit more practice on creating primitives and manipulating them and moving them around 3D space. And then once we're done doing that, we're going to dress things up. So we'll go up to Game Object and then down to Create Other, and we're going to start things off with a cube as we've done before. With that cube selected, I can press the F key to, of course, frame it, just in case we're far away from that cube. Now, we're going to make this kind of our base platform, and something that I'd like to point out is when you scale things, so I'll press the letter R to get my scale manipulator, is if I scale this cube down, I can actually invert it like I do here. So see what I did? I'm scaling it down, and then at some point I kind of turn the whole thing inside out. You want to be careful doing that with geometry. With these basic primitives, it's not so much of a big deal, but with other geometry that you import into Unity, you can actually turn things inside out and not know it. And what happens is they then become invisible inside your scene because Unity's rendering the front faces and not the back faces of things. So just be careful if you're going to take a cube and make it a very thin platform, as I'm doing here, not to invert it. So I'll scale that down so it's semi-flat, and then we just want to scale this up quite a bit to make our first kind of landing platform here. And we're just going to make a few locations in this level that we're creating. So there's our first platform. And what we can do is we can actually duplicate this whole piece. But we're going to be texturing things in a little bit. So if you want to give things unique textures, you probably don't want to duplicate this. You want to actually create a brand new piece from scratch. So I'll do that at this point. I'll go back to Game Object, down to Create Other, and then again we're going to go down to the cube. And I'll press the W key to get my move manipulator, R for my scale manipulator, and again I'm just going to kind of thin this out without inverting it, and make a second platform that will then move over here in space. And then we'll just do this one more time, Game Object, Create Other, and then we'll go down to Cube, scale that up, and then we'll just get that positioned somewhere over here. So we're just starting things off pretty simple with 3 different platforms. And we want to create kind of a way for our character to get from one platform over to the next. So the way that we're going to do this is, again, with more cubes. Create Other, cube. And now what we want to do is kind of create a ramp. Again, don't forget, if your orbit is getting a little bit strange, just press the F key and that'll zoom in on a specific selected object, make it a little bit easier to work with. So again, I'm pressing R for scale, W for move, and then E for rotate. And I'm just going to click on one of these lines here to rotate that at a specific axis. And what we want to do is kind of create a ramp from one level to the next. So we'll scale this up until it's kind of intersecting both levels. And just get that into position. Do a little bit more rotation. And again, don't forget, all of these manipulators are actually found up here in the corner, but I'm using the keyboard shortcuts for them just to make my workflow that much faster. It's always a great idea when you're working with any sort of package to learn the keyboard shortcuts. That way you're that much more efficient and you can spend more time being creative. So we're not going to worry about this bottom section intersecting down here, but we want to get this lined up so our character, when he runs across here, he doesn't really kind of bump into anything or skip across too much. So we want to take the time to get this lined up perfectly up here. And we'll talk about these tolerances later as far as how much of a lip or an edge you can have to things before it kind of causes some of the movement of your character trouble. But in this case, that's just enough tolerance or just enough of a lip that we're not really going to see anything in our character's movements. And if we do, we can always adjust it incrementally later. But that's pretty much good. So we have a ramp from this bottom level going up to that top level. And now we want to create a few more cubes to kind of find a way for our character to get from this platform over to that. So again, we'll go to our game object, create other, and then down to cube. And just put that in position. And this is why in an earlier video I said that it would be really good to just take time to get used to navigating around 3D space and of course manipulating 3D objects. That way you can make this process incredibly fast. And the faster you move, the more you can spend your energy just being creative, creating things. Okay, so we'll get a platform in position here. And then this one I'm actually going to duplicate. So again, if you're on a Mac, that's going to be Command D for duplicate. And if you're on a PC, it'll be Control D for duplicate with that object selected. Now the reason I duplicated this one is, other than it just making it very fast to create a similar object, is because I know that the textures I'm going to use on these two are similar. So I don't have to worry about that. Just get this aligned perfectly. That'll be a small platform that kind of lets us jump off into this level down here. Now let's add some barricades around this simple level. And if you forgot, as I said in an earlier video, you can actually press the space bar when your cursor is over a specific window to kind of maximize that window, which I'm going to do now. So I put my cursor here, tap space bar. I can tap space bar again to kind of jump out, and then that kind of maximizes my workspace. I know that I'm not going to be working with any of these other windows that often right now, so it's nice to kind of have just this large workspace to work with. So let's create another game object cube here. And we're just going to put some barricades kind of around each one of these platforms. Again, I will press the F key to just kind of frame that. And this is going to kind of end up being a brick wall around my platform here. We'll just center that, and then again press the R key to get our scale manipulator. And we'll just scale that up. And then I'm going to duplicate this as well, so I'll hit Control D if I'm on a PC or Command D if I'm on a Mac. Of course, with that object selected, and I'll move that over here as well. And then again, I'll keep duplicating this. I won't keep repeating the duplicate command because you should have that kind of set in memory by right now. And then what I want to do is rotate this. So I'm going to rotate that. Now when I rotate it, I'm trying to rotate it perfectly at a 90-degree angle from where it was. And I can kind of eyeball that, but if I want to get it perfect, I'm going to press spacebar again to kind of get my windows back. And as I mentioned in an earlier video, here in the inspector, as I'm rotating this object, you can see that we get those rotational values right here where the Y is. So I can actually type in a whole number like 90. That way I know it's rotated perfectly at 90 degrees. I'll just position that in space. And I'll just get it right up against this other one. You want to make sure that you don't intersect things too much. You can, but sometimes you get a little bit of flickering with the texture. So in this case, I'm going to make sure that those two don't intersect. And I'll just scale this down slightly. Again, I'm just going to grab one of these and I'll duplicate that. Grab my rotate tool, rotate it, and then I know I'm rotating this on Y, which I can see here in the inspector, so I'm going to type in 90 there as well, and then we'll just get this into position. Center it, and then just scale it up so it kind of reaches the ends here. Again, you can see that over on this end it's intersecting slightly, and that's not really a big deal, but again, you'll see some flickering. When you get into more advanced level design, you're probably going to be modeling all of these pieces yourself in a 3D application, and controlling things like this will make a lot more sense. But for right now, what we want to do is really just kind of get a jump start on understanding how to use Unity, and we're not going to worry about that too much. But we do want things to look pretty, and we don't want textures flickering. So we're going to keep this level up here barricade free, just so it gives our character a little bit of challenge. So in case he falls off, or in case he's up here, we give him the ability to kind of fall off there, so it makes it a little bit more challenging. And then we will just duplicate this piece. We're going to bring this over to our other platform. And get that into position. Again, press the F key. Anytime your orbit gets a little kind of messy as far as what you're orbiting around, you can press the F key, it'll zoom in, and then you'll be orbiting right around that object. Makes it a lot easier to work with. R for scale. And of course, we can Control D or Command D to duplicate. Duplicate again. And again, we're going to press the E key to rotate. And then over here with our inspector open, we're going to type in 90. Or in this case, let's type in 0. That was already at 90 degrees, so we'll just go back to 0 degrees. Scale this down a little bit so it's not intersecting our other pieces. And again, if I haven't made my point clear, the intersection of these these pieces of geometry is not a problem. It's not going to affect our game in any way. Just later when we add textures, you'll see how geometry that's just perfectly kind of lined up together like that will cause a little bit of flickering in the texture. So if you have like a ground plane that's doing some weird flickering, you might want to just make sure that it's not intersecting any other piece of geometry. We'll duplicate this one and get that into position. And then now we have created a very, very basic level, except for it looks like I forgot to duplicate this one piece here. I grabbed it and I hit the keyboard shortcut to duplicate, but it actually kind of just stole that piece. So let's duplicate this piece and bring that back over. And I want to scale that back down into position. When everything's gray like this, it kind of can be a little bit difficult at times to kind of see where things are. But we'll get into textures in a little bit. Start making everything come alive and look real pretty here in our scene. Okay, so a real basic level that only took us a few minutes to create. But what's great about doing these prefab levels is that you don't really have to learn anything about computer modeling or animation. Maybe at some point you have already learned that and you have a basic knowledge of computer animation and modeling, and you've worked with packages like Maya or 3D Studio Max. But the great thing about working in Unity and working with these primitives is that you can quickly build something like this to kind of rapid prototype, or just think about what it is that you want to create, and then start to kind of populate it with textures and trees and lights, which we're going to do here in a little bit. So the last thing I'll do is I'll actually grab all these pieces here. I'm going to hold down the Shift key as I'm selecting each one, and I'm just going to move that a little bit. If I kind of do this top down, I just want this platform to kind of be a little bit more at the end of that plank there. So our character has to do a little bit of a jump to get from here to here. So what you'll want to do now, as with any digital program, is you'll want to take a moment to save your work. So I'll just do a save. Command S or Control S. And then you're going to want to save this level. It's going to save into the asset folder, into that new project that you just created. So I'll just call this level 1. And we'll hit save. And then that way we can kind of incrementally save as we go along. Next up, we're going to start adding textures to everything so that we're not looking at this boring gray environment. So I'm going to jump out of this maximize scene view and press my space bar. And down here in our assets folder, this is where we want to start importing things. So we can right click in this area down here, and I can create a new folder. So I don't want just a million images and textures floating around. So we're going to name this new folder textures. And we can double click on that folder to open it up, and currently you can see it's empty. And we're going to import new assets. So we'll click on that. You want to navigate to your textures folder. And unfortunately, we can't just click and drag and bring all these textures in all at once. There is a way of doing that by just kind of going into your system folder, but at this point I don't recommend doing that because it can kind of cause some linking problems with certain assets in Unity. So we'll just kind of bring these things in one at a time. I know it's a little bit of a pain in the butt. And you can see once it's imported, we see it here in our textures folder that we created, and we can also see a preview over here on the right hand side. So we'll just repeat this process. So import new asset, and again we'll navigate to that folder. And there's only a few textures that we want to bring in, which is why doing it this way is okay. We can take advantage of doing it this way, even though it is a little bit cumbersome to have to do this every single time. But if we were working with a project, which you may learn in later videos and later tutorials, if we were working with a project that required a lot of textures, then I would actually be showing you that other method, which is a little bit more dangerous. It can cause some serious problems with your project. But in this case, it doesn't take that long to get all these textures in at once. So we're working with a brick, a grass texture, and a metal texture, and a second metal texture. And all of these textures you can find on the internet for free. If you just go to Google and type in something like free texture library or free seamless textures, you're going to find a lot of really great textures that are optimized for game use that you can start working with. Make sure that you're always using media that isn't copyrighted. And there's a lot of what's called common grounds media out there that you can use into your own games, and then you can actually build some beautiful games with uncopyrighted music and images and all sorts of great assets, even 3D models. So to start texturing the different assets here in our scene, it's actually pretty simple. All we need to do is drag and drop. So we're going to add grass to this area right here. So we'll simply left mouse button click on the grass and then just drag that onto that cube that we created. And you can see that it applies that grass to the cube. Pretty easy. We'll do that over here as well. We'll just drag and drop the grass onto this area. And then we'll use our metal for this ramp. And then this platform as well. We'll just keep that all metal like that. Just drag and drop the metal. Kind of give our level a little bit of different distinction. And then for these kind of walls here, we're going to just drag and drop our brick onto that wall. Now at first, if you take a look at the grass looks like it's showing up the way we need it to be. Same with this ramp right here. And same with the platform. All that metal seems to be showing up the way that we want. But if we look at this brick wall, so I'll just select it and press the F key so I can zoom in on it here. Everything looks really stretched out, and that's not what we want. So with your inspector open that you have over here on the right hand side, you're going to notice that you have a few options here. And down at the bottom it says tiling, and you see this X and Y. X and Y, if you're not familiar with what those are kind of coordinates in space. If you were looking, let's say, at a flat piece of paper, so let's pretend that this grass plane is a flat piece of paper that we're looking at straight down, then X would be from the left to the right. That would be our X coordinate, and then Y would be from the bottom to the top. Okay, so if we look at this, there are X and Y coordinates on this cube, and this texture is a square texture. If I click on it, you can see its preview over here. You can see this is perfectly square, but this is not square at all. This wall that we created, it's actually stretched out. So this makes sense. We took a square texture that looks like this and we stretched it out so that actually looks like the way it should. But what we want to do is we want to take this seamless or tileable texture and we want to duplicate it several times across the surface. That's why I used that word earlier, that you can go into Google and search for seamless or tileable textures. That way when you do this duplication process, you don't get any edges or kind of breaks in between the texture. So we'll select this wall. And again, in the inspector, you can see at the bottom here, we have this tiling, and we have X and Y. So let's just see what happens if we take X value, which is currently set to 1, and we type in 10. Well, you can see now our brick wall is looking a lot more the way it should. If we were to take 10 and then type in something like 30, then you can see now we're kind of squishing everything together. So we started off with 1, which was stretched, and it was essentially this one texture stretched across the surface. But then when we type in the number 10, what we're saying is take this square texture, duplicate it 10 times across the surface. And I think if we actually do 15, it's going to look a lot more natural, like the original texture. So that works out exactly the way that we want it to be. And if we look at the top here, we can see that this is duplicating as well. We can type in 10. We can even do things like 0.5 to take it down a little bit. But we're not going to worry about this top area because we're not going to visually see that very much. We're just going to worry about the sides here. So pretty simple process with the rest of our walls. What we need to do is simply just drag and drop that texture on any of our models, just like that. And we can do the same over here. Select that and zoom in, make sure it's looking right. Looks right to me. Okay, so the inner walls are looking good. And remember earlier when I said, let me move that back. Remember earlier when I said that we duplicated this because we were going to apply the same texture to it? Well, the reason for that is because if we take a look at this surface, it's generally the same size as this surface. So the texture kind of looks similar here as it does here as far as the stretching is concerned. But let's take a look at our brick walls for a second. If I jump into this kind of smaller piece here, if we compare these two, see how on this brick wall the bricks look kind of normal, but then if we look at this brick wall, they're starting to look a little squished. That's because these brick walls were duplicated, so they're essentially using the same kind of texture coordinates. So there's a couple different ways that we can fix this, but the easiest way to do it is just if you know that you're going to have things that are vastly different in size, it's important to use just different cubes altogether. So I'll go ahead and delete this. Again, it's either Control Delete or Backspace or Command Delete, depending on your system. And then we'll just create a brand new game object, and then we'll create a cube. And then we can drag this brick texture onto that cube. And then now we kind of have an independent texture to work with. And we just have to get this cube scaled and positioned to approximately the same size as the other cubes that we were working with. And then now, if we want, we can independently scale this texture for this specific cube by clicking on it again here in the inspector. Let's scale that up to exactly where we want, because if we scale it after we manipulate our texture, then we're going to have to change our texture again. So we want to get it scaled just perfect. Okay. And then we can see here that we have tiling. We can adjust that. In this case, I'll switch it over to 10. And then we get the scaling looking right for that cube as well. Okay, so now that we have all of that set up, what we want to do is add in another piece of geometry over here and use some of these other textures. So we'll go up to our game object, create cube, and we're just going to kind of set up a platform over here that we're going to do something special later on. Again, I'll press the R key to scale that. And I'm going to drag this metal 2 texture on top of that cube. So we got this box here. Scale everything down. And then I'll just grab one of these platforms and I'll duplicate that, because I want to reuse this metal texture. Press the F key to zoom in. And again, it's just nice to kind of duplicate things and quickly rapid prototype an interesting level that you can work with. Again, when you get into deeper 3D modeling, you're going to spend a lot more time thinking about how these levels look and how the layout and how the gameplay is. But for right now inside Unity, it's great that we can just so quickly create some very primitive objects, slap on some beautiful textures, and then we can start creating a very, very basic level. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create one more cube. So go up to Game Objects and then down to Cube. And I'm just going to scale this up. So it's about the size of my entire level here, if not bigger. And then we'll scale that down as well. Again, careful not to invert things, because that can cause visual problems later. You can make this nice and large. It doesn't affect the game at all. And we're just going to drag this water texture onto that final cube that we just created. So that is pretty much it for the construction of our level. Really, really simple stuff. And then, of course, for the texturing of our level as well, which is also incredibly simple. So next, let's jump into making this even more exciting by adding in some foliage or some trees. Remember earlier when we talked about creating a new project. So if I just go to File, New Project, there were all these different packages that we could import, and we didn't import any of them. And one of those packages is a package called Tree Builder. So that's why initially we didn't import all of this. We want to just import things as we go. So we're not going to create a new project right now. We're just going to go back to our assets. So right now I'm in the texture folder, so I'll just click on Assets. I'll come back here. And I'm going to right click in an empty area here, and we're going to import package. So those were all the packages that we saw when we could create a new project. And if you look, one of the packages that you can create is something called, or you can import, I should say, is called Tree Creator. So we're going to click on that now. And it's going to take a moment to import all of that. First, a dialog box is going to pop up, letting us choose exactly what we're going to import or not import. And at this point, we can just go ahead and import all of this. You're not really going to worry about which ones you are or are not importing. So we'll just click Import. And that'll just take a moment to import that entire package into Unity. And each one of these packages takes a little bit of time, and that's exactly why we didn't import everything all at once. We don't need everything. One, it can be confusing down here in our asset folder, and be a bit of a struggle to figure out which each one is. And two, it would also take a long time to load your project. And we want to kind of keep things as optimized as possible, because as I mentioned earlier, the faster you can move around, the more time you have for creativity. So it's importing all the different assets that are available in that Tree Builder package. And once those are all imported, you're going to see that there's a new folder here called Standard Assets. If I double click on that, inside there you see we have Tree Creator. And I can double click on that, and then you can see another folder called Trees, and of course I'll double click on that to open that up. And eventually we get down to this tree object that we can simply just drag into our scene. So we'll just find a spot that where we want to plant our very first tree. I'm just going to grab this tree and just drag that right into my scene. And you can see we get this tree kind of floating around in 3D space. And what's nice is it's paying attention to the geometry itself. So you can see as I hover over the brick wall, it tries to snap the tree to that brick wall. But if I move down to the grass, it snaps to the grass. And even if I go over to this platform, the tree will kind of climb up the platform. So we'll just plant that tree here in the corner of our level. And if we kind of zoom out and take a look, you can see that tree is quite huge, and that is not how big we want this tree. So we can hit the R key with the tree selected, and we can scale that down. A nice thing is that the pivot point of that tree is set at the base, so that when we scale it, it's actually scaling down to its roots instead of scaling at the center, and then that way we don't have to reposition it in height. So you may be tempted to rotate your tree at this point, but don't do that quite yet, because we're going to actually duplicate this tree and propagate our level with this tree, and we don't want these move manipulators to kind of be facing in weird axes right now. So we will rotate the trees after we've placed them, but for right now what you want to do is you just want to scale the tree to about the right size that you want, get it positioned, and then we can start duplicating this tree in our level. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this grassy plane here and I'm going to scale it up a little bit, because you can kind of design any level that you want, but for my level I want some of my trees to kind of be in the brick wall area and some of them to kind of just be scattered on the outside. So the best thing to do right now is to duplicate your tree just like you would any other object. Again, Control D or Command D, or you can go up to Edit and down to Duplicate. And with the Move tool still selected, I'll just kind of bring this tree over here. I can repeat this a few more times. Edit, Duplicate, and just kind of put a few trees here. Again, we want to just move these trees. We're not going to rotate or scale them right now. So this does look a little bit repeated, but we'll fix things in a little bit. So I'll duplicate that a few more times. Duplicate, move a tree up here. And I don't mind if the leaves are overlapping at all. That'll look good and keep our level looking kind of interesting. So some of these trees I'll have inside the brick wall, and some of them we'll place outside. Just make sure they're not floating in outer space. Although I don't know why I say that. We're working in a video game, so pretty much anything goes. And that's pretty much the amazing thing about video games, is you can create any universe that you can imagine. And I think that's really what got me excited about working in 3D in the first place. I used to be a filmmaker, and when you're creating a film you have to hire actors and worry about cameras and worry about sets and makeup and lighting. But when you start working in 3D space, you pretty much can do anything that you want. And it's amazing once you start creating all these different universes. Okay, so I put these trees over here. I'm going to duplicate this one more time because we're going to put some trees over in this other platform. I'm just going to position this tree right now, and then I'm going to forget about it for a moment and get back to the other trees. And I'll explain why we didn't rotate them until now. So if I want to zoom back over here, I'll just click on one tree, hit the F key so I can zoom back over here. And the reason I didn't rotate them at first and position them is because you can see that the manipulators, the X, Y, and Z move manipulators, are facing their correct axes. If I were to rotate this now and then go back to the move manipulator, you can see that they're facing at an angle. And you can still move this tree around, but it becomes awkward because you start moving it kind of in a more diagonal angle instead of straight up and down and back and forth. So that's why it's nice to make sure that you position all your trees first and then take a moment to rotate them to make them a little bit more unique. And of course we can kind of make some trees a little bit larger than others. Make sure that they all have unique rotations so they don't look exactly the same. And in a moment I'm going to show you how to actually edit trees, but we don't want to spend too much time focused just on how trees work inside Unity because there's a lot of other fun stuff to cover. But there's a reason this plugin or this package is called Tree Builder, and it's because we can actually build our own trees and customize how they look. You'll get this dialog importing assets every now and then when you move trees around, because Unity's kind of just reconfiguring everything. So don't worry if that pops up from time to time. It's not to worry. And we're almost done giving all of our trees a little bit of a unique perspective and angle. That way things don't look so repetitive in our scene. We can kind of zoom down in here and see how it's going to look when we're inside our game. And that's actually looking pretty good. Have a lot of nice trees kind of populating our game. And then we'll jump over to this tree. Again, I'll select something over here, like the tree, and then just hit the F key to zoom in on that area. And I'll do the same with this platform. We'll just kind of take this grassy area and extend it out a little bit past our brick wall. And I'm going to put a few of these trees on the outside. Again, you can see that our manipulator for our move tool here is set up in the proper axes. So that way, when I move things, it's a lot easier to kind of get them positioned. Move this tree inside. And again, I'm just hitting duplicate to quickly populate all these different trees. And how the system handles all this is actually quite interesting. Because these are all duplicates, it's not really taking up that much more memory when you actually create these games. Once you get into more advanced game development, you'll spend a lot of time keeping things optimized and making sure that your poly counts are low, that your textures are optimized. That way your game not only looks great, but it runs great. What is the point of working on a game or creating a game that runs really, really slow? And depending on the system in which you're outputting to, whether it's something like an Xbox or a PlayStation versus an iPhone or an Android phone, how optimized your game needs to be will depend on the power of that system. So we'll just scale these up to give them a little bit uniqueness in size, so they're not all exactly the same. And then we have some nice trees populating our world. So the last thing that I'm going to show you about these trees, even though we're not really going to do this for this specific level, is I want to show you that when you actually select a tree, over on the right hand side we get our inspector again. So let's zoom in on this one tree. And it's probably a good idea to save at this point because we're going to do some major edits. We don't want to mess up our game. So I'm just going to make this window a little bit larger so you can see what I'm doing. And you can see with this tree selected, we have this kind of node system, which is very, very cool. It means that you can actually create your own trees, and we're not going to get into creating our own individual trees right now. I just wanted to introduce this to you. And you can see here that we essentially have a base tree, and then all of these icons are pretty much our branches. So you can see that we have 1, 2, 3, 4 different branches. And then based on top of that is kind of our foliage or our leaves. So what you can do is you can actually select one of these branches and you can see all the different curves that are built into the tree to make up the tree. And you can see down here at the bottom we have these plus icons to add new branches. So if I click on that with this branch selected, you're going to see it think for a moment, and it's going to actually re-import the whole tree package, and it's going to add in a new branch to that tree. So you can see now we have branches kind of going off in 3D space in all sorts of directions. And we can actually put new foliage on it. So what I recommend is that you take a moment to create an empty scene if you want to play with this tree editor. Let's not do this here inside our scene, because you're going to see that all of these trees now have all these spiky branches sticking out of it, which isn't what we want. But you can actually select these individual branches right now and start editing them and shrinking them down, and you can actually add foliage to each one. So with this branch selected, now I can add a foliage node, and it's going to add in these foliage images, which I can then texture with new leaves. And we can actually create some very interesting alien-like trees with this tree editor. And we can select these guys, this extra branch that we created here, and we can press this trash can to actually remove it from the hierarchy here. Give that a second for Unity to reconfigure all of our trees, because it's going through all the trees and reconfiguring it, and then now we're back to our base tree. But if you want to experiment with creating your own tree systems, I definitely recommend creating an empty scene, create a single tree to work with, and start building these tree systems by simply creating the different branches and different foliage nodes that you can work with. And then you can actually get in here and start editing all the curves. But we won't work on that right now, because that gets a little bit complicated, and we don't want to start messing up our beautiful scene that we've already taken the time to create. So now everything's looking really nice, that we have kind of our geometry in, we have our textures, we kind of made things look a little bit more unique with adding in some trees. But our lighting is pretty global. It's pretty standard across the board. And lighting is where we can also make things look incredibly interesting. So let's jump into understanding lights here in Unity and adding some to our scene. So what we're going to do now is actually talk about adding lights to our scene. But we don't want to do that right now to this specific scene, because things are getting actually slightly busy. So we're going to create a new scene so we can talk about some of the lights features and individual settings without worrying about getting them organized in this current setup. But then once we understand each light fully, we'll go ahead and start adding in some lights to this scene. So the first thing that we're going to do is go up to File and then down to New Scene. So now we're actually working with a completely new scene, and if we save this out and give this a new name, so we'll just call this Light Test, you can see down here in our assets we not only have a level 1 but a light test. So this area is completely blank, and often inside Unity this can be a little bit confusing, because as you orbit around you may see a camera off in the distance but you don't see anything else, and that's because that's pretty much all that is available to us. Now don't be afraid if you double click on level 1, if you give this a moment to load up, you'll actually see that everything that we created earlier is still there. And we can get back to the level that we were creating. But here in the light test, if we double click on that, you can see that we kind of just have this blank empty space to work with. That way we can create a few lights and kind of just look at each one individually. So before we create a light, we need a few objects in here. So we'll go up to Game Object, and then we'll go to Create Other, and then as always we'll just create a simple cube and just scale this up. And what we want is to just get a few pieces of geometry in here so that we have something for our lights to shine on. So we'll create Other, and I'll create something like Sphere. Scale that up a little bit. And then just a few other primitives. So maybe something like a cylinder. And then of course you can duplicate these so we have a few more pieces of quick geometry here inside of our scene. Okay, so that should be more than enough. And if we want, just to give it a little bit of flavor, we can jump into our textures and we can drag and drop that grass texture here onto our geometry. And then we can even add in things like brick, and then maybe a few other textures to some of these other items here. Okay. So the way that we create a light is the same way that we've been creating everything else so far. We'll go up to the game object and we'll go down to create other. And then you notice that we have a few light options here. We have a directional light, a point light, a spotlight, and an area light. So the very first light that I'm actually going to talk about is directional light. So we'll create that. And the minute we do, you notice right away that your entire scene changes. We get a little bit of a light change in our scene. And you can see that the light was created here at the origin, just like all of our other objects. We can use our move tool to kind of move this up in space. Again, I'll press the F key to frame that light so that we orbit around that light specifically. So the very first thing that I want you to notice here is you'll take note that we have this light created and we can see this light icon, but we also see some rays coming out of this light in a very specific direction. And you can see that those rays correspond to the way the lighting in our scene is set up. So for instance, if you take a look at the sphere, you can see that there's a whole lot of light on this side and it's actually shadowed on this side, and you can see that that is related to the angle of this light and the way it shows up by default in our scene. If I press the letter E to get my rotate tool with this light selected and start rotating this light, then you should see that the light on all of my objects rotate as well. So in other words, wherever you're pointing these rays is of course where the light is facing. So if I were to go ahead and rotate this so that it was facing straight up, of course then the light is coming directly from the bottom, and you can see all of our objects are completely illuminated from the bottom, and our ground plane here is falling into darkness. So that's pretty much how you point a directional light. Now what is a directional light? Because as we saw in this list here, we have things like directional, point, spot, and area, and we want to figure out what the differences are between each one of these lights. The best way to describe a directional light, and it's pretty appropriate that they have this icon here, is thinking of a huge light source, something like the sun. So for instance, if the sun were up here kind of in this 3D universe, it would be casting very straight rays of light pretty much from all directions from this specific angle. So you can see that these objects are completely illuminated from this specific angle. So no matter where this light moves kind of in a left or right configuration, because this source or this light source is huge like the sun, it's pretty much illuminating anything that it points at. There's no sort of fall off here. And that's pretty much what a directional light is. As we look at the other lights like spotlight or point light, we're going to see that they have a very limited light capacity or a very narrow light region, where a directional light pretty much has an infinite light source facing in that specific direction. So with the directional light selected, let's take a look at some of the attributes that we have here in our inspector. Now we're not going to go through all of these attributes. Obviously some of these are already familiar to you, like the position and the rotation and the scale. And these things are pretty much easily adjusted by just simply grabbing the move, rotate, and scale manipulators here inside our scene. We will move and rotate a light, but we pretty much will never scale a light. There's really no purpose for doing that. But other than these position attributes, rotation and scale attributes that you see here, some other options that you have are light color. Now in the real world, even though you might think so, light is almost never white. And this is a good time to really take a moment to just look at the real environment that you're looking in. It's very easy to kind of get lost in a 3D environment and not really think about how the real world looks. But taking a moment to observe the real world is always going to make you a much better 3D artist. So take a look at the room you're in now, and I have no idea what kind of room you're in. Maybe you're in a room that is filled with fluorescent lights, which will kind of have a very cold blue feeling to them. Or maybe you're in a room that has a bunch of lamps with lampshades on it, and you might actually have a much warmer feel to your room. Or you're actually in a room that has a lot of daylight, which is going to also give you kind of a warm feeling. So right now this light is currently set to complete perfect white, which in the real world almost never happens. So we can click on this color block right here, which brings up a color swatch. And we can actually adjust this to anything that we want. You can see right away that we get very dramatic lighting in our scene. everything from reds to blues to greens to yellows, and then back to kind of more warm orangey and red colors. So as I mentioned, in the real world, nothing is really ever pure white. So you always kind of want to give a little bit of emotion or feeling to each one of your lights. So for instance, if I kind of shift this into a little bit of a warmer region like this, but not quite so much, it's a little extreme, almost like sunset. There is actually quite a big difference between what we see now, which has a little bit of heat to it, versus this, which is completely sterile and pure white. So we can actually kind of push that a little bit into the warmer regions. And if you're setting up a scene that is set maybe in the sunset time or the evening time, you're going to push this further and further and further into a specific light value. So we'll just kind of adjust that a little bit so we have a little bit of color to our light. Now, the next thing that you're going to look at is actually the intensity. And by default, we have our directional light intensity set to 0.5. If I increase that, you can see how we can completely blow out our scene. Now, this is a really sensitive value. From 0.5 to 1, you can see that this is already extreme, and it looks like our scene is being completely blown out. So be careful with how much you actually push this. I can't imagine why you'd ever push it past 1 unless you were trying to create some very stylized scene. So I'm just going to take this back down to 0.5 because I actually think that that is bright enough. And usually you have more than one light in your scene anyways, which adds even more illumination. So other than the intensity, you'll notice that the next value here is something called cookie. Now, Unity uses the word cookie, which is probably the only situation where I've heard this word used. But in other 3D programs, you might actually hear the word gobo or filter. If you're used to working in the theater, you know what gobos are. And usually these are things that are put in front of a light to project a certain shadow to give the appearance of something. Maybe it would be the appearance of grid lines or trees, or even if you were to take a flashlight and point it at the wall, you're not going to see a perfectly round white spot. You're going to see small shadows from the components inside the flashlight itself. So if you were to actually click on this at this point, the little icon next to this cookie attribute, you're going to get a whole bunch of images and textures which are pretty much loaded in here from other items we've loaded, and we're seeing a bunch of tree textures in here. The brick and the grass and these metal textures, this isn't exactly what we want. So what we need to do is go back down into our Assets panel and right-click, and we need to load in another one of those packages. So we'll go to Import Packages, and then we're going to go through this list, and you're going to see that there's a package here actually called Light Cookies. So we'll click on that. And it's going to take a moment to load this in. Here's the list that we're going to be loading, so we'll just simply click Import. And if we go back to our assets here and go into our standard assets, you're going to see this light cookies folder. And if I double click on that, you can see that there's all these different light cookies. So this is not something that I would recommend for the directional light per se, but this is something that we will use in a moment with our spotlight. So it was good that we loaded in. And I just wanted to show you that it was available here in the attributes. So with that said, let's go ahead and move on to our next light source. Now we can delete this light in our scene, but I want to demonstrate each light one by one. So you'll notice that here inside your light setup, you can actually switch this from a directional light, see where it says type, and we can switch this over to something like spot. So now we have a spotlight in our scene. So let's position this so it's facing straight down or straight enough. I'm going to switch back to my Move tool, and we're going to move this over one of our objects here. So we'll just move it right above the sphere and get that into position. So it's pretty much facing right down on top of our sphere. And let's look at some of the spotlight attributes. So the first thing that we have is range, and it's currently set to 20, but if I set that to 30, you can see that this kind of cone now extends out quite a bit and is actually breaking through our floor. about 4 times deeper than it was before. So that's pretty much what range does. It extends the strength or the distance in which the light can go. So where the directional light was kind of infinite in a specific angle, the spotlight actually has a bit of a fall off. And if, again, you're used to working with other 3D applications, you might be used to the word fall off, which from this center point where the light starts, there's a fall off and how the light strength fades over distance. So right now we have that set to 30. If I were to put this back to 10, you can see that our light isn't even reaching our sphere, and I actually have to drag the light down physically before it starts affecting the sphere. And if I turn up the intensity a little bit, you can kind of see that a bit better. So you can see at this point the light is affecting the sphere, but it's not even hitting the ground yet, and it only starts to hit the ground when that bottom part of the cone intersects the ground. So that's really where the range comes into play. Now you'll also see that this light is fairly narrow. So for instance, if we were working with a spotlight on a stage in a theater, you could see that the angle or the size of this kind of cone is very narrow. And that's actually where our next attribute comes into play, which is our spot angle. So by default that's set to 30, and if I take this slider and increase it, you can see the spot angle opens up quite a bit, and now I'm actually even hitting some of the other objects. So I'm going to increase the range a little bit, so let's just increase that to something like 25. And our intensity is similar to the intensity that we've seen before. We don't really want to take this up past 1, so we'll just kind of put it somewhere around 1 and a change there. 1 in just a little bit. And you can see that if we play with everything from our spot angle, we can narrow the light quite a bit. And of course we can change its range and of course its intensity. And just like we saw with our directional light, we can play with the color as well. So if I want to give this light a little bit more of a blue tint, I can do so. Take the intensity up just a little bit. Because what we want to do now is actually jump into those cookies that we talked about earlier. You're going to notice that there's a cookie value here, which, as I mentioned, you're not really going to use with the directional light, but the spotlight is the perfect light for using something like a cookie. And let's just go ahead and click on the little tiny circular icon right next to this cookie value to go ahead and load in a cookie. Now we get that same dialog that we had before, but you'll notice that we now have those black and white cookies in here. And if you study these are actually pretty simple to create. If you jump into Photoshop and just create some black and white images, you can create your own cookies, which can be everything from the way a tree might cast a shadow on the road. And if you can look at these look like cookies that would be associated with a flashlight. As I mentioned, when you point a flashlight at a surface, and if you have a flashlight in your home, I recommend you trying this so you can see it in the real world. You'll notice that you don't get a pure light like this. You actually get a little bit of alteration in the light intensity, which is the shadows from the light bulb and the wires in the light bulb. So if we choose something like this, you can see right away, if I zoom in here, we get a very different light setup. And this is truly what brings realism to your scene. Things like making sure light isn't always a pure white, and also making sure that your light source isn't purely even across the board. This cookie that we just added adds in a tremendous amount of realism. So if we were to switch back to a hard cookie like this, you can see that doesn't quite look as real as we want it to. There are a few light sources in the real world that might look like something like this, but in general, you might find that things look a little bit more interesting if you add cookies that look like this. So we have a nice interesting fade across the surface. So we can keep switching between different cookies. Let's locate the grid one. And if a light were shining through a grate, like in an office, you actually might get something that looks like this, which is a lot more interesting. We can create this soft fall off with this light, which looks a lot better or a lot more realistic than this super harsh edge. So don't hesitate to try and create your own cookies. All you need to do to bring them in is simply right click and bring in these assets. it would be a black and white image like the ones you see here, and then you can get some really interesting fall-offs as well. So because I've been editing this light quite a bit, let's go ahead and delete this one. So I'll just delete that light from my scene. And again, I'll go back up to Game Object, Create Other, and this time we're going to go down to a point light. So with the directional light, we had light shining at a specific angle at an infinite range. And with the spotlight, we had light shining at a specific angle with a limited range and a limited cone size. And now with the point light, we have light shining at every angle. Sometimes this is called an omnidirectional light, meaning that light isn't shining at one specific angle, it's actually emanating from every angle all at once. So you can see as we move our point light around, it's kind of shining in every angle from that center source. And you can also see this kind of spherical range around it, which gives us an indication on how this light is shaped. Just like our spotlight had a cone, that was the shape of the light or the direction of the light. With this point light, we can see that this sphere represents where our light is falling out to, and also the distance in which it's falling out. So if we look over at our inspector, we have a lot of the same attributes. We have a range, which is set to 10. If we were to put this up to something like 30, you can see that sphere that represents the range has now extended out quite a bit. And also the intensity in the center has increased quite a bit. So let's take this range back down to maybe something like 15. We can, of course, adjust the color as well. And then, of course, you have your intensity slider that you can turn up and down. So it really just depends on what you're looking for. If you are in something like an outside scene, you're going to think of using a directional light because it has that large infinite light source the way the sun does or the moon does. If you're working inside an interior scene like an office building, then maybe you're going to use something like a spotlight because it's casting down from maybe the roof. But directional lights, point lights actually create a really nice atmosphere as well. And this would be something like a street light. But you can pretty much use it in most situations to create a nice warm glow or a nice even glow across surfaces. So if we go back to our list, we can actually switch this over to an area light. And we're not going to be discussing area lights because this gets into something called baking. But I just wanted to let you know that this does exist, but we won't actually be working with area lights because we're not going to be getting into baking, which is more of an advanced feature. But take a moment to actually look at the spotlight, the directional light, and the point light to work with the colors, the intensities, and just create a simple scene like this and get a feel for these different lights. You know, you don't have to create an entire world and universe before you start adding in lights. I actually recommend that you create something simple like this so that your attention is on the light itself and adjusting some of these attributes. And don't hesitate to actually work with spotlights and work with those cookies because, as I mentioned, creating some unique cookies can create some very, very interesting lighting effects. And you can create everything from the shadows that leaves create to any sort of obstructions like these grid patterns as well. So next up, what we're going to do is we're going to start adding in some lights to our actual scene. So we'll just go ahead and jump back to our assets, double click on level 1. We don't need to save anything here. If you want to save what you've done in this lighting setup, please do. But in this case, I don't need to save this, so we'll click Don't Save. And we're now back into this beautiful scene, but it has very flat, boring lighting. And you can see how quickly, by adjusting a few lights, we can make things look very, very interesting. So let's jump right in and start adding lights to this scene.